Well, praise the Lord, my dear saints. This is Elder Adrian Hammond. I'm continuing on our study of the book of Genesis. Just letting you know the reason why I decided to do this study is because we often don't deal with what happens at the beginning. In terms of the church, we deal with the book of Acts, and we read that quite a bit because we want to know, what did they do as a church? How did it grow? Why did it grow? What did the disciples who became apostles tell the church what to do? How did they allow Christ to work in them? And what was the beginning of these things? And so, therefore, we study the book of Acts. For those same reasons, we should also study the book of Genesis. If it's the beginning of things, then we should be able to understand why things came into being and why certain characters in the Bible, why did they receive the accolades or they receive the problems, I would say, that they have, whether it was in that particular portion of time or historical. We should know why things happened the way that they did. That's why we study the book of Genesis. So within our study, we are going to start from Genesis chapter 12, verse number 9. We're going to deal with a particular instance. I'm going to bring up a few points. And hopefully you'll be able to see where it all comes from. Verse number 9, Genesis 12. And Abraham journeyed, going on still toward the south. Someone may ask the question, if the Lord told Abram that the land that he was in, that he would give it to his seed, why did Abram go further? And that's a good question. Why did Abram go further? It could have been that, as we'll read, that there was a drought. The grass or the fields, the pastures, maybe they weren't as nutritious as they could have been. And you could see it affect the cattle and everything that Abram had. And so he decided, I've heard that there was nutrition, there was enough grass, there was enough food to eat in Egypt. And isn't that interesting how Egypt became the symbol for food? That this ended up becoming what happened with Abram's descendants. We'll get into that a little bit later. But it's just something that this was not that when the Israelites went into Egypt, when we heard about them being enslaved, that wasn't the first time that they went into Egypt. That was at least the second time. The first time was Abram, and he went there, it looks like, right after he got to Canaan for the first time. But he began to go south. Verse number 10. And there was a famine in the land. And Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there. Sojourn is to stay for a little while. Maybe not for forever, because remember, the Lord had given Abram the land of Canaan, where he was. So whether Abram was going, it wasn't going to be there to halt there and to stay there. It wasn't going to be like his father. See, his father, you have to remember, his father Terah had the intention of going into Canaan, but he stopped in Haran, built up a city there, and that's where he died. That wasn't Abram's intent. His intent was to go to Egypt because of a famine. Because the famine became very difficult to withstand. You gotta remember, the southern portion of what is now Israel was not a very watered place, to say the least. Some of it was kind of mountainous, some of it was quite dry. Quite dry. So in order for him to save his cattle, save whatever he had, that was essentially where he had to go. Thank you, sir.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Excuse me there for a second. Oh, I know what that is. Okay. So, he was to go down into Egypt. And it was for a very practical reason. He didn't want himself to starve. He didn't want his cattle to starve. There was no water. So they went into Egypt. It was a famine. Verse 11. And it came to pass, when he was come near to enter into Egypt, that he said unto Sarai his wife, Behold now, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Now, that in itself is kind of innocuous. Pretty much most of you husbands would tell that your wife is fair to look upon. Some would call her a knockout. I know my wife is. Well, that's me. But knowing that your wife is probably a knockout as well. But that's how you feel. Now, whether it's true or not, that's up to whatever people think of. But to Abram, Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And to be honest, Abram's assessment wasn't just the thought in his mind, but other people thought so too. Now, the thing that gets me is she was a fair woman to look upon. A fair woman to look upon. She was 65 years old. That's the thing that intrigues me so much. Abram was 75 years old. Sarai was 10 years younger than he was. But that still puts her at 65 years old. And at year 65, she was fair to look upon. To me, that is puzzling, to say the least. Especially if we deal with the age of today. Now, maybe, quite possibly, people aged a little bit less during that time. Remember, they had descended from those who had been in the ark during the flood. Noah lived over 900 years. Shem lived around 600 years. And so 75 and 65 are really nothing. Pretty much nothing. But remember, Sarai, not only was she barren, but she, I believe, had already experienced menopause. So there was no way that she was going to bear children unless it was a miracle. That's why the idea of seed was such an interesting promise that God made to Abram. But the fact that Sarai was still a beautiful woman to look upon at age 65 is quite stunning. And that in itself should have told how the Lord preserves you. That's another thing too. Just to say this for about a few moments. The Lord does preserve his people. I don't know how many times I've seen certain people who have been in church for pretty much all their life, and how they don't even seem to age. But there are people who come in from the street. Maybe they're 40, 45 years, and they look 60, 70 years old because the streets harden them. Thank God that they've come in now and they're saved. But the streets taken away their youth. Any appearance of youthfulness, it's gone. And so to see Sarai and how she was able to maintain her beauty even at her age of 65. Again, things may have been a bit different during that time. But the key here was that Abram acknowledged that Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And there was a reason, though, why Abram said this. It wasn't just to give a compliment to Sarai. And we're going to see now in our next verse. Verse 12. Therefore shall come to pass, when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. That tells you now you're beginning to understand. Even though Abram had faith that God would bring him to the land and allow his seed to possess the land, he didn't think that the Lord was going to protect him from the Egyptians when they went down to sojourn there. Remember, only to sojourn, not to stay there. But he believed that the Egyptians were going to take his wife and kill him. He told it very truthfully. But that meant that he did not have the faith that he would gain as he went along. So he had enough faith to leave his father's house. That was good. He had enough faith to get to Canaan. That was good. But he was still lacking the faith to believe that God would bring him through and would protect him even while he was in Egypt. Because how could the Lord give him seed if the Egyptians were going to kill him? See, sometimes we don't have the faith that we think we do. And we have to ask, Lord, please, Lord, build up our faith. Now, that means you have to go through something. Many times you have to go through something. So we have to be very careful about that. But if we really want to please God, it doesn't matter what we go through. We need more faith. That's why Jesus said, if you have faith, not the size of a mustard seed, but if you would have faith as a mustard seed. And the reason why is the growth of the mustard seed. That's the reason that your faith grows as you keep going. It grows with each experience. It grows with each adversity. It grows. And as it grows, then you're able to see the Lord, how he protects his people, how he shows that they are precious to him. But it has to grow. Even with Abram, his faith had to grow. It wasn't quite where the Lord wanted it yet. Because the Lord had given Abram seed before. It's possible. Maybe the Lord was going to just give him at that time anyway. It so happens that it was a miraculous, beautiful blessing that the Lord gave Abram. But at this particular juncture in his life, he still had to grow. Saints, in our juncture of our life, there's still plenty of room for us to grow. We haven't quite reached it there yet. We haven't quite obtained it yet. We're getting there, but we're not there yet, saints. Increase our faith, Lord Jesus. Lord, forgive our unbelief, that we may know that it is you, Lord. You bring us. You're the one that brings us to the time of our blessing. We don't know how else we're going to do it, but we thank you. I would say this. My faith is much more now than it has been 2 years ago because of the things that my family has went through. Your faith is much more than it was maybe possibly even 6 months ago because of what you have went through. Abram still has to go through some things. He had a lot of faith. He had the faith enough to believe that this is God and this is Yahweh. He believed that. But there's still more he had to understand. Verse 12. Therefore it shall come... No, I'm sorry. Verse 13. Say, I pray thee, thou art my sister. Now, as it turns out, even though it doesn't say it here, as it turns out, Abram was correct. Sarai was his sister. And of course will be his sister until the day she or he died. But that was still an intent to deceive. In other words, in order to preserve his life, Abram left his trust in God and put his trust in deception. He may not have outright lied, but if you say something, even if it's truth, with intent to deceive, that is still technically a lie. So in essence, Abram lied. Not about the facts, but about the intent. He didn't tell the full story. He just got picked up that this is my sister. And of course, Sarai had to agree. So, and she was fully in compliance with what Abram said. Because she had said something. Said, I love you, honey, but that's not right. You know it's not right. She could have said something. But she didn't, because she trusted in her husband. Sometimes, saints, we just don't know. Sometimes we husbands are not necessarily the harbingers of truth. Sometimes we need some correction ourselves. But that doesn't mean that we're not heads of the house. But it does mean that sometimes we do need correction. And there are ways to do that correction without hollering and screaming and throwing things. Possibly she could have said, Abram, my Lord, or my master, or my husband, I love you. But you know what we're saying is not true. We could be trusting in the Lord right now. If the Lord had said he was going to give us seed, that means You're not going to die, Abram. You're not going to die. But Sarai agreed to make the story. And Abram, as she was going to follow whatever her husband said to do. And so she did. Say, I pray thee, thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. Now, here's the key too. Now, Sarai, again, at 65 years old or older, was actually quite beautiful woman, at least from what the account says. Abram was willing to let his wife depart from him and become part of Pharaoh's harem in order to save his life. I want you to think about this now. I want you to really think about this. It wasn't that Abram was just going to hide his true relationship with Sarai because they two were going to stay together. He thought the Egyptians were going to maybe rape her, rob him, whatever. But the fact was that the kings of that particular time often looked at the fairest people of the land to add to their harems, which essentially is what we see that Pharaoh intended to do. And Abram was willing to allow his wife to leave him to go into Pharaoh's house. That's not an act of faith. That's an act of self-preservation. Because then how could then he, Abram, then fulfill the promise or allow God to fulfill the promise that he had told him? Because who was going to be another woman that Abram was going to deal with? So all these things that we have to understand. How could he? So as you see how that lie had the potential of completely derailing the whole plan that God had for Abram. But we will see how God is merciful, how God is gracious, how God, sometimes even in spite of ourselves, he's faithful to us. And for that we should thank God every day. Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I seek. Great is thy faithfulness unto me. In spite of ourselves, God is still faithful. And we'll stop right here in terms of our account with Genesis. May God bless you and may he keep you. And thank God for his faithfulness to us. In Jesus' name.